If you think the Clarity Act decides the future of XRP, you are already looking in the wrong direction.
Clarity is always better than chaos, and the industry needs clarity. Perfection, I think, in my experience, is the market structure bill that's pending in the banking committee, is it perfect? No, certainly not. But is it better than nothing? Absolutely. And I think we need to continue to work constructively with Washington to get and continue to iterate what is already sitting in front of the banking committee to make it better. But we shouldn't give up now. We are so close.
This will be the most important XRP and Clarity Act video you ever watch, so make sure to watch this until the end. This video will completely challenge how you see the future of XRP, and I'm about to show you why 99% of people are getting this bill completely wrong. Everyone's watching the Clarity Act thinking it decides the future of XRP, but the truth is much more uncomfortable. Because this bill is not about XRP at all. XRP already survived regulation, lawsuits, and policymakers' enforcement. While XRP already secured regulatory clarity, the rest of the crypto market is just finding out what regulation looks like. The real danger inside the Clarity Act has nothing to do with XRP winning or not. This is about whether stablecoin yield gets shut down and forces the entire crypto industry to restructure. And if that happens, XRP is not the asset waiting for regulatory clarity. XRP instantly becomes the asset ahead of the curve. The Clarity Act does not matter to XRP in the traditional way. XRP is already treated as a commodity, and the XRP ledger operates as independent financial rails. And this is exactly why the Clarity Act has no impact on XRP itself. The XRP ledger functions like Swift-level financial rails, meaning it moves value without caring who issues the asset, which is why the Clarity Act rewriting security definitions barely touches XRP at all. And if you want to trade crypto without KYC, I'm gonna drop a link in the description of this video for Bitunix Exchange, the exchange partner of this channel. The Clarity Act does not matter to XRP in the traditional way. XRP does not need permission, and this is what everyone's missing out. While everyone is discussing the Clarity Act, distracted with mainstream narratives, fighting on X, XRP is sitting up at the most unique position in the entire crypto markets. The real question this week is not about how the Clarity Act is going to benefit XRP, but whether the rest of the market can function without it. Despite delays from policymakers, the real version of this bill is finally coming out of shadows. And honestly, it has very little to do with XRP. The real conflict inside this bill revolves around yield, specifically stablecoin yields, and who is allowed to offer it, under what conditions, and with how much friction. Washington is staring directly at a system where people can move money into stablecoins on major platforms and earn yield without touching a traditional bank. And the banking lobby sees that as a direct threat to their system. Banks already control stablecoins indirectly through custody, reserves, and access to the underlying financial system. And this is exactly why the panic about stablecoins replacing banks is just political theater. Banks won't simply disappear. The real issue is not control but visibility. Because when people can see money moving outside of the banks, that becomes a problem. It makes banks look less necessary, even if they still control the system behind the scenes. So the problem is framed as consumer protection, the reaction becomes regulatory pressure on yields, and the solution becomes regulating yield out of stablecoins. But at the end of the day, banks never truly lost control. This is more about gaining time than anything else, because a financial reset doesn't happen in isolation. It requires geopolitical tensions and controlled demolitions. And this is why they are trying to slow down the process while the infrastructure is being rolled out silently. This is where the Clarity Act becomes dangerous for parts of the industry, because most cryptocurrencies won't survive the Clarity Act.
The Senate Banking Committee delaying a vote on legislation to structure the crypto market and digital. The Senate Banking Committee delaying a vote on legislation to structure the crypto market and digital assets, pushing the bill's timeline to February at least. This coming after pushback from the crypto industry over whether platforms should be paying interest or be able to pay interest on rewards on stablecoins. Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong opposed the bill, saying it contains too many issues. Joining me now is the man himself, Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong. Brian, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. And you tweeted out some of your concerns. You write this: after reviewing the Senate banking draft over the last 48 hours, Coinbase unfortunately can't support this bill as written. There are too many issues, including a de facto ban on tokenized securities, DeFi prohibitions, as well as erosion of the CFTC's authority, draft amendments that would kill rewards on stablecoins. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. And first off, I just want to say that the Senate's been doing incredible work. You know, Senator Tim Scott, Senator Lummis, the Banking and Ag committees to get this bill together along with the industry. And I'm still quite optimistic that this bill is going to get done in a very bipartisan and strong way. However, the draft text we did see on Monday night this week, with just 24 hours to review it, we started to look through and noticed there was a few items in there that caused us concern. You did a good job of summarizing those, and so I was worried that going into a committee markup without a path to fix those first would have been dangerous. It would have been more difficult to change those things later with the full Senate floor, and so I did come out and say that I thought there were those issues while deferring to the Senate on the exact procedure going forward from here.
Well, I want to talk about the sticking point that you've been raising for a while now, and that is whether platforms are able or should have the ability to pay rewards on or interest on stable coins. This, of course, would be a key tool for you and the industry to convince customers to move money out of traditional banks and into crypto platforms, correct?
Yeah, so this stablecoin reward issue is very important, and I think President Trump has showed incredible leadership here, creating a strong crypto agenda. We just got the Genius Act passed into law, which actually did enable stablecoin rewards to happen. The banks had their own concerns, and we reached a good outcome in the Genius Act. And now the banks really are coming and trying to undermine the president's crypto agenda. I mean, these are the same banks that debanked him and his family, right? And they want to come in and say that Americans should not be able to actually earn more money on their money. They're trying to protect their own profit margins, taking money out of the pockets of hardworking average Americans and putting it into the coffers of these big banks that are hitting record profits. And so our view is that there should be a level playing field where banks and crypto companies can lean into stablecoin legislation as an opportunity. And that includes paying rewards to Americans so that they can earn more money on their money.
But the regulations and the guidelines that the banks have to follow are not going with them, right? I mean, things like, deposit insurance or other investor protections to ensure that you don't have a run on the bank. What about those guidelines that you would not face, and investors may not get those kinds of protections that are in place at a traditional bank?
Yeah, so you're right. The banks do have quite a heavy burden on regulation, and the reason is because they do something called fractional reserve lending. They don't actually store all your money at the bank. They're lending out a good chunk of it, and that's what actually causes additional risk, which can be these runs on the bank. Now, some people would say, yes, but there's FDIC insurance. Okay, that's great, but it's only up to $250,000. So if you have more than that in a bank, you can actually lose your money if there's a run on that bank. So I actually believe that fractional reserve lending, or fractional reserve banking, I should say, introduces more risk into the system. I think it's more risky to keep your money there. By contrast, under the Genius Act, stablecoin reserves are held 100% in short-term U.S. Treasuries. And so there is no fractional reserve with these stable coins. They should not be subject to the same regulation as banks. That's the world that the banks entered into to have the privilege of doing fractional reserve, which brings along this additional risk.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because one analyst would say to the banks, interest on stablecoins could shift how the consumer liquidity is used, and instead of financing the private sector, stablecoins are actually financing the government, as the Genius Act restricts the investment of reserves to short-term Treasury securities, right?
Yeah, well, Secretary Bessent, I think, has been a big proponent of stablecoins and crypto legislation for that reason. It's creating a lot of demand for the U.S. Treasuries, which is important to bring down those interest rates. But I'd say, crypto companies actually have just as much of a right to go out there and do lending. We don't do it with a bank license with fractional reserve in the way the banks do. But if customers want to opt into lending out their own money, they can do that and actually, in many cases, earn better rates than they would get through a bank. So This is really just another example of crypto updating the financial system, whether that's with payments or lending or capital formation. And the banks need to have competition, right? Most Americans, something like 87% of Americans believe the current financial system is not serving them adequately. There's all these concerns about affordability and why aren't they earning more on their actual money that they're holding in these banks? And so crypto is providing competitive pressure for the banks to improve their products. They should lean into it as an opportunity, not view it as a threat and try to convince the Senate to ban their competition.
Now let me break this down in very simple terms. Stablecoin issuers and banks are all sitting on the same page. However, let's now get clear about XRP's position, because this is exactly what most people are missing out about what's happening. XRP just went through the battlefield, survived years of regulatory pressure. At this point, the market no longer treats XRP as a speculative asset. XRP has earned the trust of banks and financial institutions. XRP will not become more legitimate just because the Congress passes a new bill. XRP's status as not being a security does not change at all regardless of the Clarity Act being approved or not. If the Clarity Act moves forward, it introduces structure for the rest of the markets, lowers uncertainty for institutions, and creates an environment where capital can move freely and easy. When structure replaces uncertainty, it opens the liquidity gates for institutional capital, and XRP historically performs better in that kind of environment. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because yield is the foundation of the conflict inside this bill. It has nothing to do with narratives and everything to do with how money actually flows. Washington's only worry is about people parking money in stablecoins instead of banks, which is why lawmakers are trying to close what they see as a loophole where third parties can offer yield without being the issuer. If that loophole closes, centralized platforms that rely on passive yield take the first hit. On the surface, it might sound that centralized platforms will complain about those changes, but at the end of the day, they won't have a choice. They will simply have to adapt because yield simply doesn't disappear. Yield will simply move towards compliant structures, and this is where XRP matters. Simply because XRP does not rely on yield incentives or loopholes. XRP operates as financial infrastructure. When rules become more clear and markets become more structured, assets that can handle real financial activity will rise at the top. And XRP is already there, while 99% of cryptocurrencies won't survive regulation.
I think, anytime there's a new market, there's a lot of people that run into that market and try to show that they can solve a problem, they can deliver a customer need. I have said publicly before that I think 99% of all crypto probably goes to zero. But there is that 1% where I think that is focused on solving a real problem for real customers and is able to do that at scale. And that's going to be game-changing, and I think that's going to continue to grow significantly in the decades ahead.
Either from a technical perspective or from the regulatory framework, XRP survives. Most of cryptocurrencies won't make it to the end. Let me know in the comments if you made this video to the end. I want to know who are the real ones. I'm gonna see you in the next one.